A brand new Boeing 737 costs around $110 million. The raw scrap aluminum inside that same aircraft, every panel, every rib, every stringer, is worth roughly $24,000. Yet when an airline decides to retire that same jet, it generates millions. Not from the metal, from what's inside it. If you've ever flown over the American Southwest, approaching Phoenix, descending into Las Vegas, you've probably spotted them from your window seat. Rows of white airplanes parked wingtip to wingtip across miles of brown desert. Hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. They look abandoned, left to slowly fall apart under the sun. And most people assume that's exactly what's happening. It's the opposite. A commercial airliner is routinely worth more dead and dismantled than alive and flying. And those desert facilities aren't graveyards. They're component warehouses, feeding a supply chain worth billions of dollars a year. You've actually watched this economy at work, even if you didn't realize it. You may have noticed an older aircraft type gradually disappearing from your usual routes. The model you used to fly on a particular connection, quietly replaced by something newer. If you've ever sat on one of those older aircraft, the yellowing plastic trim, the worn seat fabric, the sealed-over ashtray still visible in the lavatory door, you might have wondered whether a 25-year-old airplane is actually safe to fly. The answer is yes, but not for the reason you'd think. That airframe may be a quarter-century old, but its engines, landing gear, and flight computers have likely been swapped out multiple times, replaced with certified components harvested from other aircraft that were torn apart in the desert years ago. Look closely at the plane outside your gate window, and you might notice the paint on an engine cowling doesn't quite match the fuselage. That's not sloppy maintenance. That engine was likely pulled from a different airframe entirely, overhauled, recertified, and bolted onto your flight. What actually kills a commercial airplane isn't age, it isn't metal fatigue, it isn't a crack in the fuselage, it's a maintenance bill. Every commercial aircraft must undergo a series of progressively invasive inspections throughout its life. The most extreme is called a D-check. A comprehensive structural overhaul required roughly every 6 to 12 years. During a D-check, the airplane is essentially unbuilt. The interior is stripped to bare walls. The paint is chemically removed down to raw metal. Engineers inspect every structural joint, every rivet, every inch of skin for microscopic fatigue cracks and hidden corrosion. The process demands up to 50,000 labor hours and keeps the aircraft in a hangar for as long as 2 months. 50,000 hours. That's a single mechanic working around the clock every day for nearly 6 years on one airplane. The bill lands between $1 and $6 million, and that's before replacing anything they find. For a newer aircraft worth tens of millions, this is routine. But as an airframe ages and its market value drops, a threshold approaches. The moment the D-check bill exceeds the residual value of the hull, the aircraft is permanently grounded, not because it can't fly, but because nobody will pay to prove it still can. This sometimes happens to jets barely a decade old, perfectly functional machines grounded by arithmetic. The plane doesn't fail, the math does. That equation is what sends a plane to the desert, and the desert is chosen deliberately. Aluminum corrodes in moist air. Different alloys react against each other at every joint and fastener when water vapor is present, and a commercial airframe uses several different alloys throughout its structure. The Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona averages 10 to 20% relative humidity. The bone-dry air arrests that chemistry before it starts. When a retired aircraft arrives at a storage facility, technicians drain the fuel system, flush every tank with a lightweight oil that leaves a thin anti-corrosive film, and remove anything hazardous, hydraulic fluid, batteries, pressurized oxygen bottles, the pyrotechnic charges in the evacuation slides. Then they seal it. The sealant is a specialized latex compound called Spraylat, applied in 2 layers. A black undercoat embedded with fibers, tough enough to peel away cleanly when the time comes. Over that, a bright white top coat designed to reflect solar radiation. That white layer keeps the aircraft's interior 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the surrounding desert air. The difference between preserved electronics and baked, brittle wiring. You'd assume the entire aircraft gets this treatment. Seal it up tight, lock out the desert, but walk up to one of these preserved planes and you'll find the entire underside of the fuselage left wide open, unsealed, exposed to the air. It sounds counterproductive, but sealing it completely would be worse. Desert temperatures swing dramatically between day and night, and that cycling causes moisture to condense on the interior walls of the fuselage. A fully sealed aircraft traps that moisture inside, creating a humid microclimate in an aluminum tube, exactly the conditions that accelerate corrosion from the inside out. By leaving the belly open, the denser, cooler air drains downward and exits through the aircraft's own drainage valves. The aircraft survives the desert not by being sealed against it, but by being engineered to breathe. That's what keeps a grounded airplane from eating itself in the desert. What happens when it's finally marked for teardown, and the single piece of paper that determines whether each part is worth a fortune or worth nothing is next. Subscribing takes 1 second. When a plane is marked for permanent teardown, a specialized crew dismantles it over 3 to 6 weeks. The sequence isn't arbitrary, it follows the money. Engines come off first. They're unbolted from the pylons, lowered onto custom shipping stands, and removed with extreme care, because this is where the real value lives. A pair of turbofan engines can represent as much as 70% of the aircraft's total recoverable value, often millions of dollars per engine depending on remaining flight hours. If an engine has limited time left, it doesn't sell whole. It gets torn down further into individual blades, discs, and modules, each sold separately to keep other engines running worldwide. After the engines, the crew works inward. Navigation computers, communication radios, hydraulic pumps, each unit is cataloged at its exact point of removal, because the documentation trail that determines its value starts here. The cabin comes apart section by section. Even the APU, the small jet engine buried in the tail, gets extracted and routed for resale. The landing gear stays on until the very end. Not because it's less valuable, gear assemblies are strictly life-limited and highly sought after, but because the airframe needs structural support while everything else is being removed. Only when the fuselage is ready to be lowered onto wooden cribbing does the gear finally come off. A single narrow-body teardown produces 700 to 1,000 individually tracked components ready for the secondary market. The remaining shell goes to a recycling crew with heavy shears and diamond saws. But here's what determines whether those components are worth millions or worth nothing. None of them can legally fly again without paperwork. Aviation operates on a zero-trust model. Every harvested part is assumed unairworthy until proven otherwise. It gets routed to a certified repair station, stripped down and tested, not with a visual check, but with methods designed to find damage the human eye would never catch. The most vivid of these is fluorescent penetrant inspection. The component is cleaned, then coated in a low-viscosity liquid containing fluorescent particles. Through capillary action, the same force that pulls water up a paper towel, the liquid seeps into any surface-breaking crack, no matter how fine. After a dwell period, the surface dye is washed away and a developer powder is applied that draws the trapped liquid back out. The inspector kills the lights and hits the part with ultraviolet light. Any crack glows bright green against the dark metal. The part either passes or it doesn't. If it passes, the station issues an authorized release certificate. That single document is what transforms a piece of used metal into a legal aviation asset. For the most critical parts, engine turbine discs, landing gear trunnions, the documentation goes even further. These life-limited parts have a finite number of pressurization cycles they're certified to endure, and the only way to know how many remain is an unbroken paper trail stretching from the day the metal was forged to the present. Every flight, every installation, every repair, documented and traceable. The industry calls it back-to-birth traceability. If a turbine disc is certified for 20,000 cycles and the records show 15,000, that disc has 5,000 cycles of remaining life and it's worth a fortune. But if there's a gap, a missing logbook entry, a signature that can't be verified, the part doesn't get retested or given the benefit of the doubt. It's condemned. $50,000 of pristine titanium reduced to scrap because no one can prove how many cycles it has actually endured. The paperwork isn't a formality attached to the part. The paperwork is the part. The metal is just what carries it. Condemning pristine titanium over a missing signature sounds extreme until you understand what happens when the system fails. In 1989, counterfeit bolts in the tail section of a Convair 580 caused a structural failure over the North Sea that killed all 55 people on board. The bolts were visually identical to certified aerospace hardware, but the metal lacked the heat treatment to survive flight stresses. The tail tore free. That disaster, and others like it, forged the documentation system that governs aircraft teardowns today. How vulnerable that system remains became clear in 2023. A UK-based distributor, called AOG Technics, had been supplying used engine components to airlines and maintenance organizations worldwide. The parts were real aerospace metal pulled from real engines. But the release certificates, over 60,000 of them, had been forged on a home computer by a man working out of a London garage. Signatures fabricated, serial numbers altered, inspector names that belonged to people who didn't exist. The fraud was caught when mechanics at a Portuguese airline noticed physical wear on a component its paperwork claimed was factory new. They contacted the engine manufacturer. The signatures didn't match. The employees listed didn't exist. Up to 96 aircraft were grounded worldwide. Maintenance crews tore apart functioning engines to hunt for suspect components. The industry absorbed tens of millions in damages. The data attached to an airplane part is as load-bearing as the titanium itself. Everything described so far works because the aircraft being retired today are built primarily from aluminum, straightforward to sort by alloy, melt, and reuse, at roughly 5% of the energy needed to produce virgin aluminum from ore. The industry consistently recovers 85 to 95% of a retired aircraft by weight, but the Boeing 787 and Airbus A350 are built from up to 50% carbon fiber composite. Carbon fiber cannot be melted. The resin bonds are permanent. Once cured, they don't reverse. Recovering the fibers means burning off or dissolving the resin, and both processes degrade the material beyond aerospace use. Roughly 12,000 commercial aircraft are projected to retire over the next 20 years. As more of those are composite rather than aluminum, the industry's recycling infrastructure is heading toward a problem it wasn't built to solve. Next time you fly over the desert and spot those rows of white aircraft baking in the sun, you're not looking at a junkyard. You're looking at a warehouse. The engines on those planes will fly again, on different airframes, at different airlines, over different continents. The landing gear will touch down at airports the original aircraft never visited. The avionics will navigate routes they were never programmed for. And every one of those parts will carry a paper trail stretching back to the day it was forged, because without that trail, the metal is worthless. A retired airplane doesn't stop flying. It just flies as 1,000 different pieces on 1,000 different planes, each one verified by a sheet of paper that matters more than the titanium. What's something on an airplane you've always noticed, but never understood? Drop it in the comments.